It is a profound privilege, dear reader, to bear witness to God's mysterious and beautiful work in the world, to frame it in words, when so often it defies them. My name is Father Thomas, and I have had the honor of serving the small, often forgotten community of St. Jude Thaddeus for over 30 years. Ours is a parish nestled in a valley that time seems to have bypassed, where the pace is slower and the air still carries the scent of pine and rain-washed asphalt. Yet, even in such a quiet corner, the restless currents of the world found their way, slowly eroding the foundations of steadfast faith, leaving behind a subtle, pervasive secularity. But in the heart of our stone-walled church, we held fast to something ancient, something that seemed to whisper of eternity. Our St. Jude's is not a grand cathedral, nor a soaring edifice of modern design. No, she is a humble, sturdy vessel of faith, built of local granite in the late 19th century, with simple, stained-glass windows that diffuse the morning light into a kaleidoscope of muted jewels across the worn wooden pews. The air within always carried a faint, comforting perfume of old incense, beeswax, and damp stone, a testament to generations of prayers breathed into existence within its hallowed walls. For many, myself included, it was more than just a building. It was a living, breathing sanctuary, a quiet harbor in a world that clamored ever louder. And at the very heart of this harbor, gracing the wall behind our altar, was our most treasured possession, a sacred focal point around which all our communal prayers seemed to orbit. It was a crucifix, hand-carved from dark, rich walnut wood in the very same century the church was built. I remember the first time I saw it, as a young priest newly assigned to St. Jude's. The sculptor, clearly a master, had imbued the figure of Christ with an astonishing blend of sorrow and sublime love. The tilt of his head, the subtle arch of his back, the way his hands were rendered, not merely nailed, but seemingly offered in surrender, all spoke of a suffering that transcended pain, reaching instead into the boundless depths of divine compassion. The grain of the wood itself seemed to flow with a silent current, giving the impression that the figure, though static, was imbued with life, breathing with the very essence of the Passion. It wasn't just a depiction, it was a presence. During Mass, my gaze would often drift to it, especially during the consecration. The way the flickering altar candles cast dancing shadows across the carved contours of Christ's face seemed to bring him alive, his eyes, though closed, radiating an ancient sorrow, yet also an infinite, quiet peace. It was a visual sermon in itself, a constant, tangible reminder of the sacrifice at the heart of our faith. My parishioners, too, felt its power. I saw their eyes lift to it, seeking solace, finding strength. It was the anchor of our small community's spiritual life, a silent sentinel of grace. Among those who revered it, though perhaps in a manner he himself didn't fully grasp, was Robert Brodie, our town's police chief. Robert was a good man, steady and dependable, with a square jaw and eyes that had seen far too much of the world's harshness. He attended Mass most Sundays, sitting in the third pew from the front, always on the left. His attendance, I observed over the years, seemed less an act of ardent devotion and more a deeply ingrained habit, a respectful acknowledgement of tradition and community expectation. He was a man of procedure, of evidence, of the tangible. He believed in the clear, undeniable facts of the world, and perhaps because of this, he carried a certain weariness in his soul, a quiet skepticism towards anything that couldn't be neatly categorized or explained. Yet, even Robert, I believe, found a strange comfort in the silent gravitas of our crucifix. I often caught his gaze lingering on it, a flicker of something undefinable crossing his usually impassive face, perhaps a longing for a certainty that logic alone could not provide. Life in St. Jude's, with its predictable rhythms of prayer and routine, rolled on, comforting in its monotony. Each morning, just after the first blush of dawn painted the eastern sky in soft pastels, I would arrive at the church. My sacristan, Mrs. Gable, a woman of formidable faith and even more formidable organizational skills, would often be there already, preparing the altar for morning Mass. the quiet clinking of chalice and paten the only sound in the vast stillness. But that particular Monday morning, the air was different. A cold, damp chill had settled over the town, seeping even into the thick stone walls of the church. The sky outside was a uniform, heavy gray, threatening rain that never seemed to quite fall. I unlocked the heavy oak doors, the familiar groan of the hinges echoing slightly, and stepped inside, Mrs. Gable bustling in behind me, her sensible shoes making a soft scuffing sound on the tile. The sanctuary, as always, was shrouded in the gentle gloom of the pre-dawn hours, the only illumination coming from the single, small sanctuary lamp, a ruby glow marking Christ's presence in the tabernacle. I began my usual quiet walk down the main aisle, my eyes accustomed to the dim light, my heart settling into the familiar peace of the sacred space. Mrs. Gable was already making her way towards the sacristy, her footsteps purposeful. Then I stopped. A cold, hollow sensation bloomed in my chest, a sudden, disorienting emptiness. My breath caught, suspended somewhere between my lungs and my throat. My eyes, which had been drifting towards the altar, suddenly fixated on the wall behind it. Where the hand-carved walnut crucifix should have been, there was nothing. Absolutely nothing. The wall was bare. An immense rectangular shadow, a slightly lighter patch of stone where years of sun and dust had been kept at bay by its presence, was all that remained. It was as if a vital organ had been ripped from the very body of the church. The air in the sanctuary, which moments before had felt thick with centuries of prayer, now felt thin, sterile, shockingly vacant. The quiet that usually brought solace now echoed with a terrible, silent scream. "Father!" Mrs. Gable's voice, usually so crisp, was a hushed whisper, laced with an alarm that mirrored my own dawning horror. She had emerged from the sacristy, her gaze now also fixed on the terrible void. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief and pain. I could feel the blood drain from my face, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead despite the church's chill. It was not merely the loss of a valuable artifact, though it was certainly that. It was a violation, a deep, gaping wound in the heart of our sanctuary, a desecration of the sacred space, and a profound, agonizing theft from the soul of our community. The empty space on the wall seemed to swell, a dark, silent testament to a transgression that reached far beyond the material. The crucifix, our silent witness to divine love and suffering, was gone, and in its place, an emptiness that spoke of desolation. The sacristan, a woman named Agnes, whose hands had lovingly polished every wooden pew and brass fixture in St. Jude's for 30 years, stood frozen, her usually bustling frame utterly still. The word, "gone," had barely left her lips, a whisper, laced with an alarm that mirrored my own dawning horror. She had emerged from the sacristy, her gaze now also fixed on the terrible void. Her hand flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with disbelief and pain. I could feel the blood drain from my face, a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead despite the church's chill. It was not merely the loss of a valuable artifact, though it was certainly that. It was a violation, a deep, gaping wound in the heart of our sanctuary, a desecration of the sacred space, and a profound, agonizing theft from the soul of our community. The empty space on the wall seemed to swell, a dark, silent testament to a transgression that reached far beyond the material. The crucifix, our silent witness to divine love and suffering, was gone, and in its place, an emptiness that spoke of desolation. The arrival of Chief Robert Brodie, barely an hour later, brought with it a distinct shift in the very air of St. Jude Thaddeus. The hushed reverence that usually permeated our old stones was abruptly challenged by the crisp efficiency of his presence. He was a man built of pragmatism and order, his uniform pressed with military precision, his movements economical, his gaze direct and assessing. I had known Robert for years. His wife, Eleanor, was a faithful communicant, though Robert himself attended Mass with a certain dutiful distance, as if keeping a respectful but firm boundary between the mysteries of faith and the quantifiable realities of his profession. Now, standing amidst the shadowed aisles, he was every inch the chief of police, his professional demeanor a stark, almost jarring contrast to the sacred violation we all felt. He offered a curt, sympathetic nod, a brief acknowledgement of the profound loss, but his eyes immediately began to scan, to dissect the sacred space into a grid of potential evidence. He spoke in low, calm tones to his officers, who fanned out with a quiet competence that felt strangely intrusive in the sanctuary. Crime scene tape, stark yellow against the aged gray stone, stretched across the main aisle, partitioning off the altar and the sacrosanct space where our Christ once hung. It was not simply a piece of wood that had been stolen. It was the very heart of our worship, the visible manifestation of our faith, and to see it now reduced to a crime scene felt like another layer of desecration. The air, which had so recently carried the faint aroma of incense and beeswax, began to take on the sterile scent of antiseptic and the metallic tang of police equipment. "Father Thomas," Chief Brody began, his voice devoid of any undue emotion, though I knew him well enough to detect the underlying gravity. "I understand this is a deeply upsetting event for you and your parish. Please know we will treat this with the utmost seriousness." He spoke the words like a vow, a promise born of civic duty rather than spiritual understanding. For him, it was a theft, an infringement on property rights, a breach of peace. For me, it was a wound to the spirit, a tearing of the sacred veil. The crucifix, after all, was not merely property. It was an icon, a conduit, a silent homily etched in wood and suffering. His investigation was meticulous, dispassionate. Fingerprint dust settled like ghostly snow on the worn kneelers. Photographs flashed, stark and unblinking, capturing the emptiness on the wall from various angles. The side door, often left unlocked during the day for silent prayer, had clearly been forced. A pry mark, barely visible to my untrained eye, was a gaping wound to his. He knelt, not in prayer, but to examine scuff marks on the floor, the disturbed dust a silent witness to the intruder's passage. "There's not much ambiguity here, Father," he stated, rising with a sigh that was more professional than personal. "It was a forced entry, a targeted theft. Someone knew what they were looking for, likely for resale, given its age and craftsmanship." He held up a small, clear evidence bag. Inside lay a single, dark button, torn from some cheap fabric. "We found this near the sacristy door. Common, unfortunately, but sometimes enough." My heart sank with each pronouncement. The logic of the law, a well-oiled machine of inquiry and deduction, was already beginning to grind. It sought concrete answers, material evidence, tangible motives, and the truth, I knew, could sometimes be far more elusive, hidden in the labyrinthine chambers of the human heart, or indeed, beyond human comprehension entirely. Within hours, the police had cast a net, not wide, but precise. The initial focus of the investigation quickly centered on a young, desperate drifter named Leo. He had been seen loitering near the church on the night of the theft, a shadowy figure at the edge of town, easily overlooked by most, but not by a watchful police force. He fit the profile, Robert explained to me later that afternoon, in my sparsely furnished rectory office. Young, transient, no fixed address, no visible means of support. A desperate man, perhaps, pushed to desperate measures. "Father," Robert said, leaning forward in the armchair, his hands clasped, the picture of measured authority. "I understand your concern. You're a man of the cloth. You see the best in people, the potential for redemption. But my job is to see facts. And the facts, at this preliminary stage, are pointing squarely to this individual." I listened, my fingers tracing the worn leather of my rosary beads, a silent comfort. "Chief Brody," I began, my voice soft but firm, "I understand the need for procedure, for evidence. God knows, we need order in this world. But I also know the fragility of the human spirit, the way circumstance can crush a soul. This young man, Leo, do we know anything of his story? What has led him to this point?" Robert met my gaze, a flicker of something I couldn't quite decipher, perhaps weariness, perhaps a touch of impatience, in his blue eyes. "Father, His story, while possibly tragic, doesn't excuse criminal acts. We'll get his story, yes, in due time, in the interrogation room. But right now, we have a clear pattern, a forced entry, a valuable item stolen, and a known transient with a history of minor infractions seen in the immediate vicinity. That's a strong lead, a logical lead, he continued, his voice resonating with the certainty of a man who implicitly trusted the system he upheld. The law, Father, is like a well-oiled machine. It gathers evidence, it processes information, it identifies suspects, and it finds the truth. It may not always be the truth you want to hear, but it will be the truth based on what can be proven, on what can be seen and touched and measured. We don't deal in intuition or feelings. We deal in facts. I understood his perspective, of course. Robert Brody was a good man, an honorable man, dedicated to his community. He believed in justice, in accountability. But I saw, with a clarity that felt almost painful, the limitations of his worldview. His unwavering faith was placed in the meticulous machinery of the legal system, in the undeniable weight of empirical evidence. There was a profound certainty in his eyes, a conviction that all problems could be solved by procedure, by the diligent application of rules and the cold light of reason. It left, it seemed to me, precious little room for the mysteries of the human heart, for the unseen forces that shape destiny, let alone for the divine. Sometimes, Robert, I ventured gently, the truth is larger than what fits into an evidence bag. Sometimes the facts, while true in themselves, don't tell the whole story, especially when a human soul hangs in the balance. He offered a polite, almost practiced smile. And sometimes, Father, a theft is just a theft. A crime is just a crime. And the person who commits it needs to be held accountable. That's the truth I deal in. And I assure you, we will find it. He paused, collecting his notes, his mission clear. We'll bring your crucifix back, Father, and we'll make sure the person responsible faces justice. He rose, his posture erect, his gaze fixed on the task ahead. He was confident, capable, and utterly convinced of the path he was on. As I watched him leave my office, his footsteps echoing down the quiet rectory hallway, I felt a deep unease settle in my soul. The law, with all its admirable logic and unwavering pursuit of tangible truth, seemed so utterly inadequate to address the vast emptiness left by the missing Christ and the spiritual chasm that had opened in our town. I knew Chief Brody would find a truth, but I harbored a profound, unshakable intuition that it might not be the truth, not the truth that God Himself might reveal. And in that quiet knowing, a silent prayer began to form in my heart, a desperate plea for something beyond human understanding, something only divine intervention could provide. Chief Brody was a man of his word, and a man of his methods. His well-oiled machine of procedure, as I had mentally dubbed it, hummed with impressive efficiency. Less than a week after the emptiness of our altar had been revealed, the news rippled through the quiet arteries of our town. They had found him. The drifter, Leo, the young man I had seen lingering near the church, had been apprehended. And, as Chief Brody had predicted with that unwavering certainty of his, Leo had confessed. The call from Robert came late that Tuesday afternoon, his voice devoid of any triumph, yet laced with the quiet satisfaction of a job professionally executed. "Father Thomas," he'd said, his tone clipped and businesslike, "we've got him. The young man, Leo. He confessed to taking the crucifix. We found him sleeping rough by the old train tracks, just like we suspected. He's been arraigned. Case closed." A strange, complex tapestry of emotions unwound within me at his words. There was, I confess, an immediate, almost instinctive sigh of relief. The missing crucifix, that gaping wound in the heart of St. Jude Thaddeus, had created a spiritual ache in me, a constant low thrum of sorrow. To know its perceived perpetrator was identified, to feel the swift hand of human justice bringing a form of closure, was, on a purely human level, a comfort. The weight of the unknown, the lingering fear that such an act of desecration might go unanswered, began to lift. Our small community, too, seemed to collectively exhale. The whispers of suspicion, the unease that had settled over familiar faces, gave way to a palpable easing of tension. Life, it seemed, could now return to its predictable rhythms. But then, as always, the quiet stirrings of a different truth began to emerge from the deeper currents of my soul, nudging at the edges of that comfortable relief. "Chief?" I asked, my voice softer than I intended. Did he say why?" There was a brief pause, a rustle of papers on his end, a subtle indication that for Robert, the why was often secondary to the what and the what you. "Standard stuff, Father. Desperation. Needed money. He tried to sell it, but it was too recognizable, too unique. He panicked and hid it somewhere. Won't say where, yet, but he will. They always do." His confidence was absolute, a sturdy oak in the face of what he considered a solved equation. My initial relief began to curdle, replaced by the familiar prickle of unease that had accompanied Robert's departure from my office just days before. "May I visit him, Robert, to offer pastoral care?" It was more than a professional duty. It was an insistent call from the very core of my priestly being. The idea of this young man, Leo, alone in a jail cell, stripped of even the dignity of his own despair, gnawed at me. Robert's sigh was almost imperceptible, a faint wisp of exasperation. "He's confessed, Father. The legal process is well underway. But if you insist on spiritual comfort, I suppose I can arrange it. Just don't expect any new information for us. He's a closed book. A closed book." The phrase hung in the air, cold and definitive, echoing the sentiment that the human soul, too, could be reduced to a neatly bound volume, its chapters read, its ending predetermined. But I knew, with an intuition born of decades listening to confessions and witnessing the complex tapestry of human frailty and grace, that no soul was ever truly a closed book. There were always hidden pages, unwritten epilogues, divine interventions yet to be scribed. The next morning, armed with a visitor's pass and a heart heavy with unspoken questions, I made my way to the county jail. It was a utilitarian brick edifice, squat and unyielding, a stark architectural antithesis to the soaring arches and stained glass solace of St. Jude's. The air inside was thick, not with reverence, but with the stale tang of disinfectant and the metallic undertone of regret. Doors clanged, keys jangled, and the hushed voices of officers on duty seemed to underscore the oppressive silence of those confined. After navigating a labyrinth of corridors that seemed designed to disorient and diminish, I was led to a small, stark interview room. A single metal table bolted to the floor dominated the space, flanked by 2 chairs of the same unforgiving material. And then he was brought in. Leo. He was thinner than I remembered, his frame almost skeletal beneath the drab, ill-fitting jumpsuit. His hair, once shaggy but hinting at a youthful vitality, was now dull and matted. His face, etched with smudges that spoke of sleepless nights and unwashed grief, held a haunted pallor. But it was his eyes that truly arrested me. They were not the eyes of a hardened criminal, nor even of a man wrestling with guilt. They were hollow, utterly devoid of light, like wells that had long run dry. They held the vast, bottomless despair of a soul that had simply given up. I pulled out the chair opposite him, a small act of defiance against the harshness of the room, and offered him a gentle smile. "Leo," I began, my voice striving for a warmth that might pierce the chill of his surrender. "I'm Father Thomas from St. Jude Thaddeus. I just wanted to come and see how you were doing, to offer whatever comfort I can." He merely nodded, a slow, almost imperceptible movement, his gaze fixed somewhere beyond me, somewhere beyond the walls of this room, perhaps even beyond the confines of his own present reality. He didn't meet my eyes. It was as if the effort of holding my gaze was too much, too demanding of a spirit already utterly spent. "The chief told me you confessed," I continued, choosing my words carefully, avoiding any tone of accusation or judgment. "Is there anything you'd like to talk about?" Another long silence. The air hummed with unspoken things. I waited patiently, offering him the silent space he seemed to need, a stark contrast to the interrogation I knew he must have endured. My own heart ached for him, this broken young man who seemed to carry the weight of the entire world on his slight shoulders. Finally, he spoke, his voice a raspy whisper, barely audible above the low thrum of the building's ventilation system. "Yeah," he said, the word emerging like a weary exhalation. I took it, the statue, from the church. He then proceeded to recite the facts of his confession, not with the nuanced details of a man recounting his own actions, but with the flat, dispassionate tone of someone reciting a script. It was late, Monday night. I knew the church was usually open, but it was locked. I found a window, in the back, near the sacristy. It wasn't locked. I went in, and I saw it. The wooden one. I knew. I thought I could sell it. For food. For a bus ticket out of here. He paused, then continued, picking up the thread of his story as if from memory, not from experience. I pulled it off the wall. It was heavier than I thought. I tried to carry it out the way I came in, but I couldn't get it through the window. So I left it outside, in the bushes, ran, panicked. Then I heard the sirens a few days later. They were looking for me. Knew it was for that. I ran to the tracks, hid it then, deep in the thicket. Thought I could come back for it later. But then they found me. As he spoke, I searched his face, his eyes, for any flicker of the expected emotions. Shame, regret, defiance, even the cunning of a thief. But there was nothing. Only that profound, unsettling emptiness. The words came out of him like pebbles dropped into a deep well, each one distinct, but making no splash, no ripple. It was the account of a crime, delivered by a man who seemed utterly detached from its commission. This was the profound dissonance the summary mentioned, and it resonated deeply within me. "And the crucifix, Leo? Do you remember where you left it?" I asked, my voice gentle, though my mind was reeling. He shook his head slowly. "No, Father, it's gone. I couldn't find it when I went back. Maybe someone else found it. Maybe the police did. I don't know." There was no frustration in his voice, no hint of a man who had misplaced a valuable object, just a weary shrug of resignation. "Leo," I pressed, my heart aching, "are you truly guilty of this? Did you truly take the crucifix?" His eyes, for the first time, flickered to mine, but it was a brief, almost pained contact before they retreated back to their vacant stare. "What does it matter, Father?" he whispered, his voice cracking with a raw, unexpected vulnerability. "Everyone says I did. The police, they had the evidence. Said they saw me. Said people saw me. I was there, near the church. I was hungry. I was cold. I wanted out. It just felt easier to just say yes, to just let it be over." His words struck me with the force of a physical blow. Easier to just say yes, to just let it be over. It was not a confession of guilt for the theft of our crucifix. It was a confession of guilt for the sin of existing, for being poor, for being unwanted, for being utterly, irrevocably alone in a world that had seemingly condemned him long before he had ever set foot near St. Jude's. His confession was not a revelation of a crime, but a raw, agonizing act of surrender, the final collapse of a spirit that could no longer bear the weight of fighting for its own truth. He had been worn down, ground into dust by the relentless machinery of a world that offered him no quarter, no hope, no escape. I saw it so clearly then. He wasn't confessing to this particular theft. He was confessing to a lifetime of perceived failures, of being an outcast, of being a burden. The crucifix was merely the latest, most convenient symbol onto which all his accumulated shame and hopelessness could be affixed. He was a lost soul, adrift, and had simply chosen to succumb to the current that pulled him towards the inevitable. My heart constricted. This was not justice. This was despair, neatly packaged and labeled as an admission of guilt. How could I, a priest called to minister to the depths of the human spirit, stand by and allow such a crushing injustice, even if the world saw it as a straightforward solution? I reached across the table, my hand pausing before gently covering his, which lay limp and unresponsive. His skin was rough, calloused, bearing the silent testimony of a hard life. "Leo," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "God sees you. He knows your heart. He knows the truth, and you are not alone." He didn't pull his hand away, but there was no response, no flicker of understanding or comfort in his dead eyes. It was as if my words, however heartfelt, were just more sounds in the vast, indifferent expanse of his suffering. He had retreated to a place far beyond the reach of human solace. I stayed with him for a while longer, speaking softly of God's boundless mercy, of his unwavering love, even for those whom the world had cast aside. I offered him a silent prayer, a heartfelt plea to the divine for this young man, for his aching soul, for the truth that felt so desperately out of reach. But as I left that sterile room, the clang of the cell door echoing behind me, and walked back through the stark corridors of the jail, the weight of what I had witnessed settled upon me with chilling finality. Leo's confession, so readily accepted by the law and the relieved populace, was a profound lie, not of deceit, but of utter, soul-crushing resignation. He was not a criminal. He was a victim, not of the theft, but of a hopelessness so profound it had swallowed his very will to live, to hope, to even claim his own innocence. The justice system, in its diligent pursuit of tangible evidence, had found its convenient answer, but it had missed the beating, broken heart of the matter. And in that quiet, aching knowing, the plea that had begun to form in my heart after Robert had left my rectory solidified into an urgent, unshakable conviction. Logic and law had brought us to this terrible impasse. Only something far beyond human understanding, something transcendent and divine, could possibly unravel this knot of despair and reveal the truth that God, and only God, knew. My silent prayer now became a desperate, insistent cry to heaven. Lord, you must intervene. You must show us your hand. For this young man, for our community, for the very soul of Chief Brody, we need your truth, not merely our own. My silent prayer had become a desperate, insistent cry to heaven. Lord, you must intervene. You must show us your hand. For this young man, for our community, for the very soul of Chief Brody, we need your truth, not merely our own. That plea, born of the aching quiet of Leo's cell and the sterile certainty of the chief's investigation, echoed within me, shaping itself into an unshakable conviction. Logic and law, in their admirable pursuit of order, had brought us to this terrible impasse. Only something far beyond human understanding, something transcendent and divine, could possibly unravel this knot of despair and reveal the truth that God, and only God, knew. I spent the next morning in a fever of thought and prayer, pacing the worn rug of my rectory study. The image of Leo's hollow eyes burned behind my eyelids. The empty space on the church wall mocked my hope. But then, an inspiration, gentle yet insistent, settled upon me like a benediction. St. Jude Thaddeus, our very patron saint, the patron of lost causes, of things despaired of the impossible. A novena, 9 days of focused, fervent prayer. Not for retribution, not for a specific outcome dictated by my own limited understanding, but for God's truth to be revealed, for His will to be done, for clarity where there was only confusion, and for mercy where there seemed to be none. I knew it would be a challenge. In a town increasingly prone to cynicism, to an over-reliance on what could be seen, touched, and quantified, calling for a novena for a confessed criminal and a missing statue would strike many as foolish, perhaps even an act of clerical eccentricity. But my heart knew otherwise. This was not a plea for a miracle of convenience, but a profound yearning for divine light in a deepening gloom. That Sunday, the air in St. Jude Thaddeus was thick with unspoken tension. Word of Leo's confession had spread like wildfire, mingled with a quiet satisfaction among some that the case was closed, the desecration avenged. As I stood at the altar, preparing to deliver my homily, I looked out at the familiar faces, some etched with curiosity, others with judgment, a few with an expectant hope. The empty space above the altar, where our beloved crucifix had once hung, seemed to throb with an almost physical ache, a silent wound in the heart of our community. My dear brothers and sisters in Christ, I began, my voice, I hoped, steady despite the tremor in my soul, we gather today carrying heavy burdens, The loss of our sacred crucifix has wounded us deeply, and the swift conclusion of the investigation, leading to the confession of young Leo, has brought a certain finality. But I stand before you today not to praise or condemn, not to celebrate human justice, but to remind us of a justice far greater, a truth that often eludes our earthly sight. I paused, letting my gaze sweep across the congregation, meeting eyes, seeking understanding. We are a people of faith, called to look beyond the surface, to discern the movements of the Spirit even in the most perplexing circumstances. And what could be more perplexing than a young man confessing to a crime, yet bearing the countenance of one utterly lost, utterly broken, rather than truly guilty? My visit to Leo in his cell has left me with an unsettling conviction that while the law may have found an answer, the truth, God's truth, may yet be veiled. A murmur rippled through the pews. I saw some faces harden, others furrow in thought. Chief Brody's wife, Sarah, sat in her usual pew, her hands clasped tightly, her gaze unwavering, though I noted a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. Robert himself, as I expected, was not present. His convictions, forged in the crucible of evidence and procedure, left little room for the ambiguities of faith. Therefore, I continued, my voice gaining strength, I am calling upon our parish to embark upon a novena to Saint Jude Thaddeus, the patron of impossible cases, of desperate situations, of all those who are lost and without hope. For the next 9 evenings, we will gather here, in this sacred space, to pray. But our prayer will not be for retribution. It will not be to confirm our own judgments. Our prayer, my friends, must be for truth, for God's truth to be revealed, in His own time and in His own way. We will pray for the return of our beloved crucifix, yes, but more importantly, we will pray for healing for Leo, for clarity for Chief Brody, and for all of us to have the grace to see with the eyes of Christ. I emphasize that St. Jude was the saint of the utterly lost, of those for whom all human avenues seemed closed. Leo, in his despair, feels utterly lost. Our community, in its division, feels a certain loss of peace. And that empty space on our wall, it is a poignant symbol of something profoundly missing, something that only divine intervention can restore. Let us pray not for a miracle to fulfill our desires, but for a miracle to fulfill God's divine plan. Let us open our hearts not to what we expect, but to what God might reveal. The silence that followed was different from the pre-sermon tension. It was a contemplative quiet, pregnant with possibility. After Mass, as I greeted the parishioners at the church doors, the reactions were varied, as I had anticipated. "Father, with all due respect," began old Mr. Henderson, a man whose faith was as solid as his opinions, the boy confessed, "The police have done their job. Aren't we undermining the law by questioning it?" "We are not questioning the law, Mr. Henderson," I replied gently. "We are appealing to a higher court, the court of God's divine mercy and truth. Are we not called to seek justice for all, even those who might have lost hope in it themselves?" Others offered quiet encouragement. "I'll be there, Father," whispered Mrs. Rodriguez, a widow who had found solace in prayer for many years. "My heart tells me something isn't right, too." And then there was Sarah Brody. She approached me, her face a mask of polite composure, but her eyes betrayed a hidden turmoil. "Father Thomas," she said, her voice soft, "thank you for your words. I'll be here each night." She didn't elaborate, but the quiet determination in her gaze spoke volumes. I knew how deeply Robert relied on his professional certainties, and for his wife to so openly embrace a spiritual path that challenged those certainties was significant. It was a testament to her own deep faith, and perhaps a quiet plea on behalf of her husband's soul. The first evening of the novena began with a tentative gathering. Perhaps 20 souls, a fraction of the Sunday congregation, settled into the pews. The church felt vast and hushed, the flickering votive candles casting long, dancing shadows. The empty space on the wall, stark and exposed, was our silent witness, a constant reminder of our purpose. We began with the rosary, the beads clicking softly in the quiet, then read from the Gospels, focusing on passages about unwavering faith, in the face of despair. We concluded with the prayer to Saintes, Jude Thaddeus, each word resonating with deeper meaning. Most holy apostle, Saint Jude, faithful servant and friend of Jesus, the Church honors and invokes you universally as the patron of desperate cases, of things almost despaired of. Pray for me, who am so miserable. Make use, I implore you, of that particular privilege given to you to bring visible and speedy help where help is almost despaired of. Seek, as we recited it together, a faint, shared hum of hope seemed to fill the sanctuary, pushing back against the chilling grip of doubt. Over the next 9 days, the novena became a quiet, spiritual battle. Each evening, as dusk settled over our small town, the church doors opened for those who chose to answer the call. The numbers fluctuated. Some, like Mr. Henderson, found their initial skepticism confirmed by the absence of immediate results and ceased to attend. "It's just prolonging the inevitable, Father," he'd offered one afternoon, shaking his head. "A confessed crime is a confessed crime." Others, however, seemed to draw strength from the perseverance. There were the regulars, the bedrock of my parish, whose faith was a quiet, enduring flame. But then there were others, less frequent churchgoers, who were drawn in by curiosity, by the palpable sincerity of the prayers, or perhaps by their own unspoken anxieties about the nature of justice and truth. I would often see Mrs. Brodie, always there, seated quietly a few rows back, her profile serene, her eyes often fixed on the barren wall. We exchanged only brief, knowing smiles, but her steadfast presence was a source of comfort to me, a tangible sign that not everyone in the town, not even those closest to the legal establishment, was entirely convinced by the official narrative. It spoke to a deeper spiritual hunger, a longing for something more than human logic could provide. I often wondered what she prayed for, whether it was for Leo, for the crucifix, or perhaps for the softening of her own husband's resolute heart. Leading the novena each night, I poured my entire being into the prayers, into the readings, into the brief reflections I offered. I spoke of the unwavering faith of Mary, of the hidden life of Jesus, of the times when God's plan seemed utterly contrary to human expectation. I emphasized that true faith wasn't about demanding a specific miracle, but about trusting in God's goodness and wisdom, even when the path ahead was shrouded in darkness. I felt my own faith, already bruised by Leo's despair, being both tested and fortified. There were moments, late at night, alone in the rectory, when a chill doubt would creep in. Had I been foolish? Was I simply prolonging the suffering, clinging to a romanticized notion of innocence against the cold, hard facts? But then, an image of Leo's vacant eyes would resurface, or the profound emptiness of the altar, and the conviction would return, surging through me with renewed force. This was not about my wisdom, but about God's. The very act of communal prayer, even with its fluctuating numbers, forged an invisible current in the church. The quiet murmur of rosaries, the shared recitations, the simple act of kneeling together in a shared yearning for truth. It created a sense of collective purpose, a spiritual energy that defied the cold finality of the legal judgment hanging over Leo's head. Outside the church, the town went about its business, some satisfied, some indifferent, some secretly gossiping about my seemingly quixotic quest. But inside, night after night, a small, determined band waged a silent spiritual battle against cynicism and despair. We were praying not just for a miracle, but for the very soul of our community, for the courage to believe in something beyond what our senses could confirm. As the 9th day dawned, a profound sense of exhaustion settled over me, mingled with a quiet anticipation. This was it. Leo's sentencing was scheduled for the very next morning. The crucifix was still gone. There had been no earthly sign, no whisper of hope, no dramatic revelation. My prayers, offered with such intensity, had felt like whispers into a void, like casting bread upon the waters with no certainty of its return. Yet, beneath the weariness, there was also a deep, abiding peace. I had done what I could. I had called upon God. I had called upon my people. I had placed the matter entirely in His hands. The quiet spiritual battle had been fought. not with swords, but with murmured prayers and unwavering intention. Now, only the final vigil remained. The air outside was sharp with the promise of a cold, clear dawn, but inside St. Jude Thaddeus, the silence was absolute, a profound velvet cloak that absorbed every stray thought, every hesitant breath. I stood at the threshold of the nave, the heavy oak doors now locked and secured behind me, the last of the streetlights fading to a faint glow through the stained glass windows depicting scenes of St. Jude's steadfast hope. The final vigil. The phrase felt heavy on my tongue, tasting of both exhaustion and an unshakable, fragile hope. I walked slowly down the aisle, my footsteps echoing softly on the ancient floorboards, each creak a gentle punctuation mark in the vast quiet. The only illumination came from a single votive candle I had lit earlier, its flame a solitary, defiant flicker before the barren space on the wall where our cherished crucifix once hung. Its light danced, painting shifting shadows on the stone and plaster, making the emptiness seem even more stark, more profound. It was a wound, an open gash in the heart of our sanctuary, and in my own. 9 days. 9 days of fervent prayers, of shared intentions, of a collective yearning for revelation, for justice, for truth. And yet, here we were. Leo's sentencing was scheduled for the very next morning. The clock, that relentless arbiter of human affairs, was ticking away the last moments of what little hope remained for him in the eyes of the world. My own prayers, offered with such intensity, had begun to feel like whispers into a void, like casting bread upon the waters with no certainty of its return. Each evening, as I had knelt before the empty altar, I had poured out my heart, my pleas mingling with those of my parishioners. We had prayed for the thief, for the return of the crucifix, for God's truth to be revealed. We had asked for a miracle, but the days had unfolded with a relentless, disheartening normalcy. The police investigation had concluded with unwavering certainty. The legal machinery, once set in motion, churned forward, oblivious to the spiritual anxieties of a small parish priest. The world had offered its solution, and it was a solution of iron bars and a shattered life. I reached the altar and knelt on the worn cushion, the chill from the stone seeping through my cassock. My gaze was fixed on that empty space. It wasn't merely the absence of an object, it was the absence of comfort, of the familiar presence of Christ suffering for us. In its place, a silence that screamed of loss, of unanswered questions, of a God who, for now, remained utterly, inexplicably hidden. My human spirit cried out against the apparent futility of it all. Had our novena been for naught? Had my faith, which I so earnestly preached to others, proven insufficient in this moment of true crisis? The weight of my own helplessness pressed down upon me, a physical ache in my chest. I had tried to be a shepherd, to guide my flock through uncertainty, to offer them solace and hope. But what solace could I offer when my own heart felt so heavy with doubt? I thought of Leo, alone in his cell, perhaps sleeping, perhaps staring at the ceiling, counting the hours until the gavel fell. His confession, though spoken with his own lips, still resonated with an unnatural hollowness in my memory. His eyes, devoid of the shame of a true culprit, held only the infinite weariness of a soul that had given up, that had accepted its fate, however unjust. He was not a hardened criminal. He was a broken young man, lost in the indifferent machinery of a world that had too readily written him off. My heart longed for him, for the injustice I intuitively felt festering beneath the veneer of legal certainty. Was this the truth God intended? Could this be the final word? And then there was Chief Brodie, a good man, a just man, in his own way, a man of logic, of evidence, of systems that, in his experience, rarely erred. He saw the world in black and white, intangible facts and irrefutable proofs. He had done his job, followed the rules, brought in the suspect, secured the confession. For him, the case was closed. He had attended Mass out of habit, a legacy perhaps from his own upbringing, but his faith, I had always sensed, was a practical, rather than a mystical, affair. He believed in the order of things, in human institutions. A miracle, an act of divine intervention, would be an affront to his meticulously constructed world, a violation of the very principles he lived by. How could I, a priest whose very life was predicated on the unseen, hope to reach a man so firmly grounded in the seen, the tangible? And yet, his wife had come to the novena, her presence a silent testament to a crack in his armor, a longing for something more. The silence of the church intensified, no longer merely an absence of sound, but a living presence, a crucible. It was in this profound stillness, amidst the shadows and the flickering light, that a different kind of prayer began to form within me. It was not a prayer of petition, not a fervent plea for a specific outcome, for the crucifix to magically reappear, or for Leo to be suddenly exonerated by some irrefutable human evidence. Those prayers, I realized, were still tethered to my own understanding, my own limited vision of how God should act. They were still, in their own way, an attempt to dictate terms to the divine. No, this was something deeper, something born of the stripping away of all my certainties, all my desires for a particular resolution. It was a surrender of my own will, my own judgment, my own insistence on knowing the how and the why. I felt the weight of my helplessness, not as a burden to be thrown off, but as a gateway to something greater. It was the moment where my human efforts had exhausted themselves, where logic failed, where hope, as I understood it, had reached its earthly limit. I closed my eyes, the warmth of the votive candle a faint caress on my eyelids, and allowed the tears, long held back, to trace slow paths down my cheeks. They were not tears of despair, but of raw, unadorned faith, a faith that had shed its need for proofs, for signs, for a tangible reassurance that God was listening. This was faith in its purest form, simply being in God's presence, even when that presence felt like an echoing void. "My Lord," I whispered into the vast emptiness, my voice barely audible even to myself. "I do not know what to do. I have prayed. My people have prayed. We have asked for your truth, for your justice, but I understand nothing. I see only darkness for this young man, for this community, for my own heart." I paused, breathing in the scent of old wood, dust, and melting wax. I surrender my understanding. I surrender my desires. I surrender even my hope for a specific outcome. And then, the true prayer of that night emerged, not as a demand, but as a humble, aching plea for communion. I ask only this, Lord: do not abandon us. Do not abandon Leo in his cell, even if the world condemns him. Do not abandon Chief Brody in his certainty, for his soul too yearns, however unconsciously, for something beyond human law. And do not abandon this grieving parish, which looks to you for comfort and truth. My voice trembled, imbued with an urgency that transcended intellect, reaching into the deepest wellspring of my priestly heart. Simply make your presence known, whatever form it takes, however mysterious, however impossible it may seem to our human eyes. Remind us that you are here. Remind us that you are not bound by our logic, our expectations, or our limitations. Let your will be done, not mine. Let your love be known, not merely understood. The words hung in the air, absorbed by the ancient stone and soaring arches. The silence that followed was different now, not empty, but resonant, pregnant with possibility. I was no longer striving, no longer wrestling with God or with my own doubts. I was simply present, a humble vessel in a dark church, offering up all that I was, all that I knew, and all that I did not know, into the boundless, unfathomable mystery of His love. I remained kneeling, eyes closed, hands clasped, the single candle's flame flickering behind my closed eyelids like a tiny, steadfast star in an infinite night. I waited, not for a thunderclap, not for a sign, but simply waited, content in the quiet act of faith itself, suspended between absolute darkness and the whispered hope of dawn. The words, "suspended between absolute darkness and the whispered hope of dawn," had truly been a testament to the state of my soul in that moment. I was adrift in a sea of unknowing, holding on to only the fragile thread of faith. My eyes remained closed, the single votive candle, a dim, pulsating star, against the velvet blackness behind my eyelids. The air in the sanctuary, once heavy with the chill of doubt and the weight of my own inadequacy, began to shift. It was subtle at first, a perception more than a sensation, like the whisper of a breeze through an open window when no window is truly open. Then came the warmth, not the sudden, intrusive heat of a radiator kicking on, nor the gentle, familiar glow of morning sun filtering through stained glass. This warmth was internal, emanating from within the very fabric of the old church, as if the stones themselves were exhaling a sigh of profound peace. It enveloped me, a pervasive, tender embrace that chased away the last vestiges of the night's chill. It was a warmth that felt less of the physical world and more of the spirit, reminiscent of the comfort one feels in the arms of a loved one after a long, weary journey. My clasped hands, once cold and tense, relaxed in its embrace. A deep, steady pulse seemed to thrum through the floor beneath my knees, not a vibration, but a resonance, a frequency that resonated with the very core of my being. Slowly, carefully, I opened my eyes. The darkness of the sanctuary had softened, diffused by a nascent glow. It was not a sudden burst of light, but a tender blossoming, like the first hesitant blush of dawn painting the eastern sky. From the bare, scarred space on the sanctuary wall, where our beloved crucifix had been brutally torn away, a light was now emanating. It was a soft, golden luminescence, unlike anything I had ever witnessed. It wasn't electric, for there was no source, no filament, no bulb. It wasn't the harsh, artificial light of man, nor even the natural, yet bounded light of sun or moon. This light was alive, ethereal, imbued with an inner radiance that seemed to breathe. It pulsed gently, like a slow, divine heartbeat, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the sacred air, as if they were tiny, shimmering constellations. My breath caught in my throat. Every fiber of my being screamed for a rational explanation, yet my soul understood, on a plane far beyond logic, that no such explanation existed or ever could. My mind, trained in the mundane certainties of the world, struggled to categorize this phenomenon. Was I dreaming? Was this a manifestation of my exhaustion, my desperate longing? I pinched my arm, felt the sharp, undeniable pain. No, this was real, more real, perhaps, than anything I had ever witnessed. The golden light began to intensify, not blindingly, but with a deepening brilliance that seemed to draw all other shadows into itself. It began to coalesce, to weave itself into form. My eyes, wide with disbelief and an accelerating awe, fixed upon the empty space. It was as if the light itself was spinning substance, solidifying into contours, filling in the void. Slowly, silently, as if woven from the very fabric of that living light, the crucifix began to reappear. First, a faint outline, a luminous ghost of its former self, shimmering where it ought to be. Then, the delicate curves of the crossbeam, the strong, upright shaft. Bit by bit, detail by exquisite detail, the familiar form materialized. I saw the grain of the aged wood, the subtle variations in its hue, from rich umber to deep russet. The figure of Christ, so intimately known to me, emerged with agonizing grace. His head, bowed in eternal suffering and love, the delicate rendering of his crown of thorns, the slender fingers, the outstretched arms. It wasn't a projection. It wasn't an illusion. It was becoming solid, tangible, returning to its rightful place, as if drawn by an invisible divine thread. There was no sound, not even the faint whisper of settling dust or the creak of old wood. The miracle unfolded in absolute, profound silence, a testament to its origin beyond the clamor of the earthly realm. It simply was. One moment, an empty space bathed in ethereal light. The next, our treasured crucifix stood, firm and whole, back on the sanctuary wall. It was not hung. There were no visible hooks, no straining ropes, no signs of human touch. It seemed to have solidified into existence, rooted to the wall as if it had never left, yet profoundly changed by the very impossibility of its return. The wood, which before had been cool and aged to the touch, now exuded a faint, palpable warmth. Trembling, I pushed myself up from my knees, my legs feeling like water. Each step toward the altar, toward the resurrected crucifix, was an act of faith and pure, unadulterated wonder. My hand, shaking so violently I had to steady it with the other, reached out. My fingertips made contact with the ancient wood. The warmth was unmistakable, gentle yet persistent, like the residual heat from a body that has just departed, or perhaps arrived. It pulsed faintly against my skin, a living warmth that spoke of divine presence, of a power beyond comprehension. I traced the lines of the cross, the contours of Christ's body. It was real, utterly, undeniably real. Every scar, every detail that had been etched into the wood by the artisan's hand almost 2 centuries ago was perfectly restored. Yet it felt different. It hummed with a quiet energy, a silent declaration of the impossible made manifest. My gaze darted around the sanctuary. The church doors were still locked, the heavy oak forbidding any entry or exit. I checked them myself, pulling on the brass handles, testing the bolts. Secure. The windows, high and narrow, were likewise sealed, their stained glass unbroken. The alarm system, which I had personally armed hours before, had not registered a single breach. There was no explanation, no logical sequence of events that could account for this. No human hand had touched it. No human device had returned it. There was only the undeniable, breathtaking fact of its return. Tears, hot and sudden, streamed down my face. They were not tears of sorrow or despair, but of overwhelming gratitude, of a faith utterly shattered and then rebuilt, piece by impossible piece, into something immeasurably stronger, purer. I sank back to my knees, not in supplication this time, but in humble adoration. The silence of the church was no longer empty. It was filled with the resounding echo of God's presence, with the profound, ineffable mystery of His love. In that moment, everything I thought I knew about the world, about justice, about the limits of human understanding, crumbled into dust. The logical framework Chief Brody so trusted, the cold finality of Leo's confession, the very laws of physics, all were rendered secondary, subservient to a higher truth that had just unfolded before my very eyes. God had answered, not with a whisper, but with a silent, radiant roar. He had not merely heard my prayers, He had descended into the very heart of our human struggle and made His presence known in a way that defied all reason, all expectation. The crucifix had returned, not as an object found, but as a miracle unveiled. A stark, luminous reminder that even in our darkest nights, hope truly can break through, transforming what is lost into something far more profound than mere discovery. My hands, still trembling from the residual energy of that holy moment, fumbled for the phone on the small sacristy table. The air around me still hummed with an ethereal warmth, a scent of something akin to frankincense and fresh-cut cedar, though none had been lit. My heart hammered against my ribs, a wild drumbeat of fear and elation, a profound, almost incapacitating joy. Who do you call when the laws of physics have taken a sabbatical? Who would believe? Yet there was only one person I had to call. One soul whose life, whose very worldview was most profoundly intertwined with this impossible truth. Chief Brody. I punched in his number, my fingers clumsy. The ringing on the other end felt deafening in the still, sacred silence of the church. He answered, his voice gruff, a little impatient, as was his way late at night. Brody. Oh, Robert, I managed, my voice a breathy whisper, barely recognizable even to myself. It's Father Thomas. You must come to the church. Now. There was a pause, heavy with his unspoken questions, his assumptions already forming. I could almost hear the click of his professional mind trying to categorize my distress. An old priest having a moment, perhaps, or a new lead on the crucifix. Father, it's nearly midnight. Is everything all right? Have you found something? His tone was edged with a polite skepticism. the subtle implication that whatever something I might have found would undoubtedly be mundane. No. Yes, I can't explain it over the phone, Robert. Please, you have to come. Alone. I've locked the doors behind me, and they're still locked. The last part was a desperate plea for him to understand the gravity, the utter impossibility of what I was trying to convey. I knew it sounded like madness. Another beat of silence, then a sigh, deeper this time, tinged with resignation. All right, Father, I'll be there in 10 minutes. Just try to calm yourself. Don't touch anything if it's a crime scene again. He was humoring me, I knew, but he was coming. 10 minutes stretched into an eternity. I spent them kneeling before the altar, gazing at the crucifix. It was simply there, solid, real, its dark wood now seeming to drink in the last vestiges of that golden light. I reached out a tentative hand, tracing the smooth, familiar grain. It was cool beneath my touch, yet held a memory of warmth. My mind still reeled. How could I convey this? How could a man of logic, of evidence, possibly comprehend what I myself had barely grasped? I prayed, not for myself, but for Robert, that his eyes might be opened, that his heart might be ready. A few minutes later, the distinct, measured crunch of gravel outside announced his arrival. I heard the faint click of his patrol car door, the soft thud of his heavy boots on the flagstones. I went to the main entrance, unlocked the heavy oak doors, and stepped back into the shadows of the narthex. Chief Brody stood on the threshold, a silhouette against the streetlights. His patrol car was a silent, watchful presence behind him. His face, when he stepped into the dim light of the church, was a complex tapestry of professional concern and personal weariness. He looked tired, his eyes still holding the imprint of the day's stress. He probably thought I'd finally cracked under the strain of the theft. "Father," he began, his voice lowered, a solicitous, almost clinical tone. "What exactly is going on here?" He scanned the nave, his gaze moving from the empty pews to the shadowy stained glass. His hands were clasped in front of him, a posture of patient authority. I said nothing. Words felt utterly inadequate, foolish even. I simply turned and began to walk, slowly, deliberately, towards the sanctuary. The floorboards creaked softly under my weight, the only sound in the vast stillness. I heard his footsteps fall into rhythm behind me, a little faster, a little more uncertain now that I hadn't immediately offered an explanation. We reached the foot of the altar. The single votive candle I had lit earlier still flickered, casting dancing shadows. I stopped, turned to face the wall, and simply extended my arm, my hand trembling slightly, pointing to the space above the altar. Chief Brody's gaze followed my gesture. His eyes, trained to observe, took in the wall, the altar, the candle, and then they landed. He stopped dead. The measured rhythm of his breathing hitched. The professional mask, so carefully maintained, faltered, then dissolved. His jaw, set moments before, went slack. His eyes, wide now, were fixed on the crucifix. He stood there for a long moment, a statue carved of disbelief. The silence stretched, thick and potent, punctuated only by the faint hiss of the votive candle. Then, the policeman in him, the man of facts and procedures, asserted itself. He took a hesitant step forward, then another, until he was directly in front of the altar. He didn't touch the crucifix, not yet. Instead, he began a methodical, almost desperate inspection. He turned, checking the heavy main doors I had just relocked, pulling on the brass handles with a sharp tug. They were bolted, secure. He moved to the side doors, testing each one. He walked along the perimeter, peering intently at the tall, arched windows, running a hand over the cold glass, checking the ancient latches. He even pulled out a small flashlight and swept its beam across the high ceiling, looking for any sign of a breach, any hidden opening, any logical entry point. He moved with a quiet intensity, a man possessed by the need to find an answer, to restore order to a world suddenly thrown into chaos. I stood by the altar, a silent witness, offering no explanations, just allowing him his process. He was doing what he knew how to do, searching for the truth in the only way he understood. His beam finally came to rest on the digital keypad of the church's rudimentary alarm system, mounted near the sacristy entrance. He checked the log. No alarms tripped, no entry codes entered, nothing. not a single electronic whisper of a disturbance. He came back to the altar, his movements slower now, the methodical energy draining from him. His shoulders seemed to slump. His flashlight beam played aimlessly for a moment on the floor before clicking off. He looked at the crucifix again, then at the empty, locked doors, then back to the crucifix. His eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in a profound, almost painful bewilderment. The certainty, the bedrock of his professional life, was visibly draining from his face. It was as if someone had pulled a plug on his internal wellspring of reason. His gaze shifted from the returned Christ to me, a desperate, unasked question in their depths. What was this? How? Why? His lips parted, as if to speak, but no sound emerged. He seemed to be searching for words, for a framework, for anything that could contain the incomprehensible sight before him. And in that holy silence, as the last vestiges of his logical world crumbled, I watched a transformation. The police chief, the man who trusted only what he could measure and prove, looked at the hand-carved image of Christ, then at the locked church, and then, slowly, as if an invisible weight had pressed upon his shoulders, he began to lower himself. His knees, stiff from years of standing, bent gradually. His head, which had borne the weight of an entire town's security, bowed forward. He knelt, not out of habit, nor out of professional duty, but out of a profound, soul-shaking awe. He simply knelt there, a man utterly undone, silently surrendering to a truth that transcended all his understanding, all his training, all his pride. In that moment, Robert Brody, the keeper of human law, recognized the presence of a higher one. He had come seeking a crime, and instead he had found a miracle. I watched, tears welling in my own eyes, as the first seeds of true faith were sown in the heart of a man who had long believed only in what he could see and touch. And the silence in the sanctuary was no longer empty. It was filled with the resonant echo of God's perfect, undeniable answer. He rose, eventually, the weight of the moment still clinging to him like morning mist. His eyes, though still searching, now held a light I hadn't seen before, a glimmer of faith's dawn. The morning light brought no ordinary explanation, only the baffling, glorious truth of the crucifix's return. The news, born on whispers and then hushed exclamations, spread like a sacred fire through our town, igniting debate, wonder, and a renewed sense of the divine. Leo's confession, once so definitively closed, now crumbled under the weight of the impossible. The legal system, designed for human logic, had no framework for a miracle. He was released, not just innocent, but redeemed in a way no court could have orchestrated. Our parish, a tapestry of grace, embraced him, offering not judgment, but the steady hand of community, helping him find purpose and a fresh start. Chief Brody, once the epitome of measured logic, was a changed man. He continued his duties, but his steps carried a different rhythm. He still attended Mass, of course, but no longer out of mere habit. Now, when he knelt, his posture spoke of a man humbled, awestruck, a man who had looked upon the impossible and finally, truly, seen the face of God. The simple act of kneeling, once a social formality, had become a profound act of worship. The miracle, never officially declared by any ecclesiastical authority, needed no such pronouncement. Its truth was etched on the heart of our community, a silent, powerful testament. God's miracles, I have come to understand, are not merely solutions to our earthly dilemmas. They are divine interventions designed to shatter our prideful certainties, to peel back the veil of our limited understanding. They remind us that His love operates on a plane far beyond our comprehension, always ready to restore what was lost, not just a wooden crucifix, but faith, hope, and the very soul of a man. The emptiness of the altar had been filled, and with it, the empty spaces in our own hearts.